Me Travis, 34 years old. Work as a vet at a small animal clinic in a mid-sized city. Been at this clinic for about 6 years now. We handle mostly small animals, some exotics. You get to know the regulars over time. Same dogs and cats come through for years. You know their history, their owners, their quirks. It matters to me, that part of the job. Not going to pretend it's glamorous, but it's real and I care about it. Anyway, background relevant to the story. Married to Priya, she's 32. She writes columns and essays for an online publication that covers culture and relationships. Does freelance pieces for other places too. The publication is one of those mid-sized digital outlets that has a decent following, serious enough for her to build a career on it. She's good at what she does. Pieces get shared around. She has an audience. We met through a mutual friend at some birthday party, I want to say 6 years back. She was the loudest voice in the room in the best way. Had opinions about everything, held her own in any conversation, never seemed uncertain about what she thought. I was coming off a long stretch of being pretty much single. Not by design exactly, just how it went. Moved to the city, settled into work, didn't put a lot of effort into meeting people. So when I met someone with that kind of energy, it was genuinely exciting. Spent the first date talking until the restaurant tried to close around us. We dated seriously from pretty early on. She was certain about what she wanted in a way that I found attractive. I respected that about her. We were together a little under 2 years before I proposed. She said yes that same evening. We got married in a small ceremony, nothing elaborate, just people we actually liked. Moved into a 2-bedroom apartment together, solid building, good part of town. One room became her office space, the other was ours. About 4 months in, she decided she wanted a cat. She'd wanted one for years, finally felt like the right moment. I work with animals, so I had no strong objection. We got Biscuit, an orange tabby, the lazy, judgmental kind. He has been my favorite thing in the apartment ever since, and that is not a joke. The first year of living together was genuinely good. I want to be clear about that before anything else. Not perfect, because a first year shared in a new space never is, but good. We had the predictable friction of 2 people who'd lived alone working out a shared life. Who cleans what, how to split costs, what counts as clean versus what counts as passable. We argued about some of it and then figured it out and moved on. There was a partnership feel to those months. I'd come home from the clinic, she'd still be writing. We'd meet in the kitchen around 7. Make dinner together or order in and eat at the table. Talk about our days, her articles, my cases. She'd ask which animals came in. I'd ask what she was working on. Saturday mornings, we'd go to the farmer's market down the street, get coffee, take our time. She had strong opinions about coffee and produce quality, and I liked that about her. Sunday evenings, we'd usually cook something more ambitious than the weeknight stuff. She'd pick a recipe. I'd handle the parts that required patience. There were nights when we stayed up too late, talking about nothing in particular. Just the kind of talking that happens when 2 people are settling into each other. I remember thinking this is actually what I wanted. It felt like we were actually building something. I was happy. I need to say that clearly before anything else, because the rest of the story doesn't make sense without it. I was not looking for problems or waiting for something to go wrong. I was married and glad about it. The shift came in the 2nd year, and I cannot stress enough how gradual it was. There was no single event, no argument that changed everything. No moment I can point to and say that's when it started. Just a slow accumulation of small things over months. The first thing I remember noticing was the dishwasher. I'd been loading it the way I'd always loaded it, the way that seemed logical to me. She came into the kitchen one evening, paused, looked at the open dishwasher, said that wasn't really the right way, explained how she had it organized. I said, okay, no problem, adjusted, which is just living with someone. A few weeks later, it was the grocery store. I'd gone out to grab things for the week and got the yogurt we usually had. Full fat, the brand I'd been buying since before we moved in together. She went to get some and mentioned she'd switched to a different brand, lower fat. Said it with a tone I couldn't entirely name. Not angry, not loud. A specific quality of quiet disappointment, like I'd missed something obvious. I said I didn't know she'd switched. I'd get the right one next time. She said, yeah, it's fine. But there was something in those words, a weight behind them. I started paying more attention to the grocery list after that. Started checking what brand, what fat content, what size. Which is not a red flag in isolation. Partners should communicate preferences. The problem was that those moments kept accumulating. There was the time I mentioned plans I'd made with my coworker for a Friday without checking with her first. She'd had something in mind for that Friday that she hadn't told me about. Said I should have asked before committing. I said I hadn't known she had something planned. She said she'd assumed we'd spend it together. I apologized, rearranged the plans with my coworker. There was the time I got a haircut without mentioning it. Came home, and she said something about how she liked it the other way. I didn't say anything about that one, but I filed it away. There was the time she was venting about something with a colleague, and I tried to offer a possible solution. She said she didn't need solutions. She needed me to listen. I said sorry. I should have just listened. She said yes, exactly. Each of those moments on their own sounds manageable. And it was manageable. I keep saying that because I want to be accurate. None of those things would make someone a villain in a story. But the consistent result of each misstep, the coolness that followed, the recalibration required. That was the thing that built up. And I started noticing what followed each one. When I got things right, when I anticipated her preferences, when I matched whatever standard existed for the apartment, the food, the conversation. Evenings were warm. She'd be present, engaged, physically close, happy to talk. When I slipped up on something, even something small, the evening would cool. Not dramatically, not a fight. She'd be more absorbed in her laptop. Conversation would be shorter. She'd go to bed earlier. And somewhere in there, my brain started doing what brains do. It started connecting the behavior to the outcome. I didn't label it a system at the time. That word never entered my head. I just started trying harder. Started being more proactive about the apartment. Cleaning without being asked. Making sure everything was stocked the way she liked. Cooking more often because she was always glad to come home to dinner, already started. Being more deliberate in conversations, asking more follow-up questions, being demonstrably interested in her work. And when I did those things consistently, things were good. So I kept doing them. Told myself this was just being a good husband, which is technically true. Those are good husband behaviors. But I was doing them because I'd learned what generated warmth, not because I was overflowing with the impulse to do them. There's a difference between those two things, and I was not letting myself look at it directly. Around this period, she was writing more, and the writing was reaching more people. Her column was getting shared more. The publication was pushing her pieces harder. She was picking up freelance work, writing for a few different outlets. A lot of the content was about what she called relationship dynamics, emotional labor, and the way it gets distributed unevenly. The idea of a partner who is present in a way that goes beyond just being physically in the room. How men are socialized to be emotionally passive in their relationships. She'd send me links sometimes, and I'd read them. And here's the thing about reading your wife's professional writing about how men behave in relationships. You're not just engaging with ideas. You're reading the framework through which she understands you. When she'd talk at dinner about partners who default to problem solving instead of sitting with feelings, or about men who show up physically but not emotionally, I knew those weren't abstract observations. She saw those patterns in me, or at least in a version of me. She never said, "Travis, you do this." It was always third person, always framed as a general phenomenon. But it was delivered across the dinner table with me as the only audience. One evening, she read me a passage from something she was working on, something about how men interpret emotional requests as criticism because of how they were raised. She read it and looked at me like she was waiting for me to recognize myself. I nodded and said that made sense as a pattern. She seemed satisfied with that. I didn't say that I'd been actively trying to do the opposite of that for months, because I'd figured out that saying I already do that came across as defensive. Defensive was the opposite of emotionally present. Emotionally present was what I was supposed to be. So I stayed emotionally present and said nothing. So I started adjusting for that too. Stopped jumping to solutions when she talked about work problems. Started staying with the feeling, asking questions, offering less and listening more. Which is actually good communication. I'm not saying it was wrong. But I was doing it because I was tracking the room, not because it came naturally. Performing the behavior of the emotionally present husband I'd been reading described in her articles. A few months into this pattern, I remember feeling a kind of tiredness I couldn't account for. Not from overworking. I wasn't pulling extra shifts. Just a background exhaustion that didn't lift on weekends. My co-worker at the clinic mentioned I seemed off one afternoon between cases. He's been married about 12 years, mid-40s, not the kind of guy who pries. I said I was fine, just a lot going on. He asked how things were at home. I said good, just an adjustment phase. You know how it is early on. He looked at me in that way where a person isn't going to push, but they've heard something. Said something like, "Sounds like it takes a lot out of you." I laughed it off and went back to the next patient. But I thought about that phrasing on the drive home, because "a lot out of you" was exactly what it was starting to feel like something was being spent that wasn't being replenished. The friend dinner happened somewhere in the middle of all this. I couldn't tell you exactly when. Priya had her friend over for dinner. They'd been friends for years. I made the food. We all sat and ate. The conversation was fine. After dinner, they moved to the living room, and I started cleaning up the kitchen. The apartment doesn't have great sound separation between the rooms. I wasn't trying to listen. I was running the water and putting things away in the normal way you do. But voices carry, and I caught pieces of what they were saying. They were talking about their respective relationships, something about a dynamic the friend was dealing with. I heard the friend say something about men needing structure to stay engaged, said something along the lines of it being basic psychology, how incentives work. Priya laughed and agreed with something I didn't catch. The friend said the women who pretend that's not how it works are lying to themselves. More laughter. I kept washing the pan I was working on, dried it, put it away, turned off the water, went back out and sat with them for maybe 20 minutes, said I was tired and went to bed. Lay there in the dark for a while, tried to convince myself I was reading too much into overheard pieces of conversation. But the word incentives sat there in my head in a specific way. I thought about the yogurt and the dishwasher and the evenings that went warm or cold. I thought about how carefully I'd been managing my behavior for months. I thought about the fact that I genuinely could not remember the last time I'd just been relaxed in my own home. Just existing without tracking anything. Didn't sleep well that night. Didn't bring it up in the morning because I didn't have the language for it that didn't sound paranoid. What would I even say? I overheard 2 words of a conversation, and now I think there's a system. So I said nothing, went to work, came home, kept doing what I'd been doing. A few weeks after the friend dinner, she published a piece that got more traction than most of her work. She mentioned it over breakfast, said it was getting shared a lot, sent me the link while I was at the clinic around lunchtime. I read it in the break room with a sandwich, read the whole thing. It was well written. I want to say that because it's genuinely true. She has a clean style, and she argues a position clearly. The piece was about maintaining passion and intentionality in long-term relationships. The argument was roughly that letting standards slip in a relationship isn't neutral. It's a slow form of neglect. That a partner who is truly engaged is one who is kept engaged through consistent and meaningful expectations. That women who hold that line are doing both people a favor. I sat in the break room for a minute after I finished it, read the last paragraph again, thought about the fact that I was the partner in this article. I was the one who needed to be kept engaged, to be held to a standard, to be managed toward investment. I wasn't a person in this framing. I was a dynamic that needed maintaining. I texted her, "Great piece," because I didn't know what to say, and I wasn't ready to say the real thing. She sent back a heart. I went back to my afternoon cases, a beagle with a leg issue, a cat that needed blood work, a rabbit follow-up, ordinary stuff. But I kept thinking about the article for the rest of the day. That evening, I came home and made dinner and didn't say anything about it. She asked how the piece was doing online, and I said it seemed like it was doing really well, which was true. We ate dinner, talked about other things, went to bed. The weeks after that were more of the same. Apartment was clean, dinners were good, I was engaged in conversation. On the surface, things were fine, but I was tired in a way that was getting harder to pretend wasn't there. I'd spend 8 hours at the clinic reading animals that couldn't speak, assessing conditions, monitoring symptoms, adjusting care based on signals. And then I'd drive home and walk into my own apartment and do essentially the same thing. Read the room, check the temperature, adjust accordingly. Stay on the right side of the standard. It was the same set of skills applied to a different setting. And at work, I was compensated for that. It was the point. At home, I was doing it to not lose something I already had, or thought I had, or was earning the right to have. I wasn't sure anymore. The Labrador case happened around this time. I want to describe this carefully because I think it matters for what came next. We'd been treating a dog for several months. 12-year-old Labrador, same family his whole life. The family was attentive, came in on time, followed every instruction, did everything right. I'd seen them enough times to know a little about them. The husband worked in construction. The wife was in education. They had a teenage daughter who sometimes came in. They really loved this dog in the way some families love their animals. We'd been managing a condition that was going in one direction, and we were trying to slow that and maintain quality of life. That works for a while. It always only works for a while. I had to make the assessment that we'd reached the end of what treatment was doing. That assessment means you have the conversation with the family. They both came in for that. Their daughter waited in the waiting room. She was too upset for the conversation room. I explained the picture as clearly and kindly as I could. Said where we were, what continued treatment would look like, what I thought was best for the dog. The husband asked how much more time. I told him honestly. He asked if the dog was in pain. I said he was managing, but the quality of that management was declining. They looked at each other the way couples do when they've already talked about something and both know what the answer is. They decided that afternoon. I was in the room the whole time. The procedure itself was peaceful. The dog was calm. But the owner was not calm, and that's completely understandable. He was a stoic guy, from what I'd seen of him over those months. That afternoon, he was not stoic. He cried through the whole thing. His wife held herself together better, but barely. Afterward, I stayed with them until they were ready to leave. Made sure they had everything, the paperwork, the information about what happens next. Their daughter came in after, and I gave her some time too. I kept it together throughout because that's what the family needed. That's the job. Got to my car in the parking lot when they'd left, sat there for a minute, then drove home. I didn't text Priya because I wasn't thinking about it. I was just driving home. Got to the apartment, opened the door. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop, headphones on. She looked up when I came in, pulled out one earbud, said I hadn't texted. She didn't know when I'd be coming home. I said I was sorry. It had been a hard day. She said she had a deadline she was trying to get through. Put the earbud back in, turned back to the screen. I stood in the kitchen doorway in my work clothes. I thought about the Labrador. I thought about the owner's face. I thought about the daughter in the waiting room. I went to the bathroom and ran cold water over my face. Stood at the sink for a while, then went to the bedroom and lay down on top of the covers, still in my work clothes. I wasn't angry. I've thought about this a lot since, and I want to be accurate about what I was feeling. It wasn't anger. Anger has direction. Anger wants something. Anger is actionable. This was something else. It was more like reaching the end of a calculation that had been running for a long time. And the answer that came back was just no. Not no to the relationship, not no to her. No to the thing I'd been doing. The managing and adjusting and maintaining. I lay there and I thought about what I'd been doing for 2 years. And then I thought about what I'd been doing it for. And then I thought about whether I actually wanted what I was working toward. And the answer was complicated in a way I hadn't let myself look at before. I wanted to come home to someone who was glad to see me. Not glad because I'd gotten the right yogurt, or had the right conversation, or hit the right emotional notes. Just glad I was there. And I couldn't remember the last time it had felt like that. The warmth I'd been earning was real in the moment it was there. But the knowledge of how it was generated changed what it felt like to receive it. You can't unknow something like that. I fell asleep without eating dinner. Woke up in the middle of the night, got changed, went back to sleep. Morning came. I made coffee, drove to work. It was a regular day at the clinic. A cat that needed vaccinations, a rabbit with a diet issue, a few standard checkups. I was present and doing my job. Between cases, I thought about whether I was being fair to her. Whether pulling back was the right thing or just a kind of passive punishment. Sat with that honestly for a while. And I decided it wasn't punishment. Punishment implies I wanted her to feel bad. I didn't want her to feel anything in particular. I just didn't have anything left to give to the performance. And not performing wasn't something I was choosing exactly. It was just what happened when the fuel runs out. Came home that evening. Made pasta, nothing complicated, made enough for both of us. Left her portion in the fridge with a note that it was there. Ate mine on the couch, watching something. She came home while I was watching, saw the note, heated up her food, said thanks. I said no problem. She sat at the kitchen table and ate while on her phone. We said goodnight later. That was the evening. And here is the thing that surprised me about the days that followed. I expected it to feel like loss. I expected the absence of performing to feel like the absence of ground beneath me, like I'd been holding something in place by continuous effort, and now it would fall. But it didn't feel that way at all. It felt like not holding my breath. I was in the apartment. I was present. I wasn't cold or sulking. I just wasn't managing anything. The space in my head that had been occupied by room reading and temperature checking was suddenly available. I thought about work on the drive home, actually thought about it properly instead of using the drive as a countdown to the next round of behavior calibration. I'd come in, feed Biscuit, watch him eat with great confidence, think about nothing in particular. I cooked when I felt like it, and ate something simple when I didn't. I watched things I actually wanted to watch, instead of defaulting to whatever wouldn't cause friction. I called my brother one evening for the first time in months. We talked for an hour. Didn't realize until after hanging up how long it had been since I'd done something that was just for me. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't a small thing. I was sleeping solidly, waking up feeling like I'd actually rested, just a degree or two more solid than I'd been for a while. It sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't. Priya noticed the change within a few days. I could tell by the way she looked at me during conversations, a kind of careful searching in her expression, like she was trying to locate something familiar and wasn't finding it in the right place. She wasn't visibly alarmed yet, just attentive in a way she hadn't been before. Then she started doing things I recognized from the early part of our relationship. Made my favorite dinner one evening with no particular occasion for it. Asked about a specific patient I'd mentioned in passing weeks earlier, a border collie that had needed a procedure. I genuinely didn't remember telling her about that dog. She'd retained it and brought it up carefully, like she was offering it to me. Said she'd wondered how the dog was doing. I told her the dog had recovered well. She seemed genuinely glad to hear it. I said thanks for asking, got up to put my plate away. She asked if I wanted to watch something together later. I said sure if she wasn't working. We watched something. It was fine, normal. But I noticed what she was doing. She was doing the thing I'd been doing, meeting a standard, managing warmth, checking the temperature, and adjusting. And I didn't know quite how to sit with that. I wasn't going to be unkind about it, but I wasn't going to pretend that a week of attention reset 2 years of something. A few days later, she suggested we go to the farmer's market on Saturday, like we used to. I said sure. We went. She got the fancy coffee and had opinions about the tomatoes. It was familiar in a way that felt strange and not strange at the same time. On the walk home, she talked about a piece she was working on, asked what I thought about the angle she was taking. I gave her an honest opinion, not the one designed to be warmly received. She listened, said she hadn't thought about it that way, seemed to actually consider it. That was new, so I was just present in a natural way. If she asked a real question, I gave a real answer. If she made an effort, I acknowledged it. Not performing warmth or manufacturing engagement, not cold either, just actually there. About a week after that, she sat down across from me on a Saturday morning. I was having coffee, reading something on my phone. Biscuit was on the back of the couch doing his impression of a statue. She said my name, and I looked up. She asked directly if I was upset with her. I said no. She said I'd been acting distant, and she wanted to understand what she'd done. I sat with that word for a second. Distant. I said I wasn't distant. I was just being normal. She said it didn't feel normal to her. She said she felt like I was there, but not really there. I thought about how to answer that, honestly. Said I'd been tired and had been carrying some difficult stuff from work. She asked if it was the Labrador case. She knew I had hard cases sometimes. I said partly yes, which was true. She nodded, said okay, but she looked like someone who had been given an answer that didn't quite cover the whole question. I went back to my coffee. She sat there a moment longer and then got up. I could hear her working in the other room most of that day. That evening, she called her friend. I could hear the rhythm of the conversation from the living room, not the words. She was on for maybe 45 minutes. Came out after, made tea, stood in the kitchen while it steeped. I was reading on the couch. She said her friend had said something that was bothering her. I looked up. She said the question had been uncomfortable because she couldn't answer it. Her friend had asked when she had last done something thoughtful for me that wasn't a response to something I'd done first. Unprompted, not reactive, just because. She tried to think of something recent and couldn't. I put down what I was reading. I looked at her. Said that was an interesting question. She said it felt like more than interesting. She sat down on the other end of the couch. Said she thought she'd been approaching things in a way that wasn't fair to me. Said she'd been so focused on what she believed a good relationship should look like, what the right dynamic was, that she'd stopped actually thinking about what she was giving me. Said she thought she'd been taking me for granted. Those words. I heard them land differently than I expected. Taking someone for granted usually means ignoring them, treating them as furniture. But that's not exactly what had happened here. What had happened was more specific, more deliberate, in a way she maybe hadn't been fully conscious of. But I wasn't going to try to explain that to her in that moment. I said I'd been feeling like I was working harder than felt right. Not said with accusation, just said as a fact. She said she understood that. Then she said something that surprised me. Said she'd been thinking about some of what she'd written. The pieces about relationship dynamics and standards and what she called keeping a partner engaged. Said she'd been wondering if she'd been applying an idea to her life instead of living it. I looked at her when she said that. It was more self-awareness than I'd expected, and I didn't know what to do with it immediately. Said I thought that was probably accurate. She was quiet for a second. Then she said she was sorry. I said okay. She asked if that was enough, if sorry was sufficient for what she was apologizing for. I said I didn't know what sufficient meant in this context. There wasn't a scale I was measuring it on. She said she wanted to know what I needed. I said I needed to not feel like I was earning something in my own home. She absorbed that, nodded slowly, said she understood. I said I wasn't sure she did yet, but that was okay. It was going to take time. Not said unkindly, just said honestly. She looked like she was processing a lot at once. I got up and fed Biscuit because it was past his time, and he'd been staring at me for 20 minutes. He ate with the full confidence of a creature who has never once earned his place. We sat in the apartment for the rest of that evening without a big conversation. Watched something for a while, went to bed. She came in later. I was still awake. She asked if we were okay. I said I thought we were working toward okay. She said that was fair. Lights out. The weeks that followed were different from anything that had come before in that apartment. She was more present in a way that felt genuine. Not strategically attentive, not running a counter system. Just actually there. Asking about my day and then following the thread of the answer. Letting me be tired when I was tired without it, meaning there was something wrong. Not requiring me to demonstrate engagement in order to receive it. Making dinner sometimes just because she felt like cooking. I responded to that, not because I was testing whether she'd maintain it, not because I was running some strategy of my own, just because there was something real there to respond to. We started talking more the way we had in the first year, actual conversations about actual things. I started saying things when something bothered me instead of absorbing it silently, which was a bigger adjustment for me than I expected. I'd gotten so used to not raising things that raising them felt like starting a conflict, even when all I was doing was saying something honestly. She engaged with it when I did. Sometimes she pushed back, sometimes she said I had a point, sometimes we talked it out properly. We had some uncomfortable conversations during that period. Nothing explosive, but real and sometimes awkward. The kind of conversations that feel slightly like pulling a bandage off, but you're better for having done it. One of them was about the article, not the one she'd published while we were in the middle of things. I'm talking about one she wrote earlier, the one about keeping a partner engaged. I hadn't planned to bring it up. but one evening she was going through old pieces to see if any warranted a follow-up. She opened that one and read it for a moment, then was quiet. I was in the room, and I waited. She said something like, "I think I wrote this from a bad place." I asked what she meant. She said she'd framed a relationship as something that needs optimization, like there's an output to maximize, and you adjust inputs accordingly. I asked if that was how she'd been thinking about us. She was quiet for a second, said probably more than she'd realized at the time. I said that was honest. She said she was sorry for that, too. I said okay. We didn't say much more about it that night, but something had been released by having it out in the open. Even that, briefly, even incompletely. There's a version of resolution that happens in big dramatic moments. And then there's the version where things slowly, imprecisely, unevenly get better. We got the second version, which is probably the more common one. I don't want to make this sound like a clean redemption arc, because that's not what it was. There were moments where the old dynamic tried to reassert itself. She'd get short about something minor, and I could feel myself starting to calculate. But she'd catch it, soften it, rephrase it, come back a few minutes later and acknowledge she'd been unfair. That hadn't happened before. That was new. One evening, she was writing something new. She'd taken a few weeks off the column and had started again. She was at the desk in her room. I was passing by to get water. She said, "Hold on," and read me a line she was drafting. Something about how relationships deteriorate when one person starts treating the other as a variable to optimize rather than a person to actually know. I stopped in the doorway, thought about that line, said it was a strong line. She said she'd been sitting with the idea for a while. I said, "Yeah, it comes through." She looked at me for a second. I said goodnight. She said goodnight. Nothing more needed to be said. I'm going to try to describe where things actually ended up without making it cleaner than it is, because it didn't resolve into some definitive moment where everything was settled and acknowledged and put away. It was more incremental than that, more like two people slowly finding a different way of being in the same space. She's not a different person. I'm not a different person. We're the same two people making different choices about how we're with each other. There are still moments where friction happens and old patterns try to surface. But there's also more of what was actually good about us to begin with. I still come home some evenings carrying a difficult case. There will always be a Labrador eventually. That's the job. And now I can come in and say it was a hard day, and that's the whole sentence. Not a prompt for a negotiation, just information from one person to another. That's the part that feels most different. Biscuit remains completely unchanged by all of this. Eats twice a day, sleeps 16 hours, judges everything. Came and sat on my chest one night during the worst of the quiet period and just stayed there. Didn't do anything, just stayed. Honestly, that meant something. Most stable relationship in the apartment. I've thought about what I'd say to someone in the middle of something like this. Not because I have any particular wisdom, and not because my situation was dramatic. It wasn't. It was pretty ordinary. My coworker asked me a few weeks after things started to improve how home was. I said better. He asked what changed. I told him I stopped trying to earn something and started just being there. He thought about that, said, "Huh." Then said sometimes that's the only move you have left. Said when you've been running toward a finish line for long enough, you forget you're allowed to stop. I told him that was exactly it. He nodded, went back to his work. That was the whole conversation. But I've thought about what he said quite a bit since, about being allowed to stop, about how much of what I was doing I'd framed to myself as effort and investment, when really a big part of it was just not wanting to lose something. And you can run on fear for a long time. but it runs out eventually. And what's on the other side of it, running out, turns out to be you. Just you, being there without the performance. I'd almost forgotten what that felt like, but I'd probably say this. If you've been trying very hard for a long time and the trying feels empty, stop and think about whether the thing you're working toward is actually what you want, or if it's just the reward that got built into a system you found yourself inside. Because you can be earning something for a long time without stopping to check if you still want it. And sometimes realizing you don't is the thing that changes everything. Not because you stopped caring, because you started being honest about what you actually care about. That's it. Still married? Cat fine? MFW. My wife wrote articles about relationship dynamics while running a behavioral incentive system at home. MFW. I was in the system for 2 years before I noticed. MFW. The Labrador is what finally made me too empty to keep performing. MFW. Stopping was the most effective thing I ever did. MFW. She panicked when the incentive stopped working on me. Greater than MFW, she had to ask herself when she last did something for me unprompted and couldn't answer. Greater than MFW. The resolution wasn't a dramatic confrontation, just two people slowly learning to be honest. Greater than MFW, the cat watched all of it and judged everyone equally.